Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Today, we're going to talk about supply chain risk and how to reduce supply chain risk. And also, we're going to talk a little bit about efforts through legislation and through company strategy to diversify supply chains and also to reshore, meaning move production back to the United States, or nearshore, like moving production to the Western Hemisphere, Mexico, Canada, South America, Central America, et cetera. There is a lot of legislation right now moving in that direction. But what's really interesting, if you look at a company like a smartphone manufacturer like Samsung, back in 2008, Samsung had all of their smartphone production in China, and they started diversifying it rapidly. And they have done a very good job of de-risking that supply chain. They've moved a lot of production to places like India, Vietnam, and other places. And so when the problems associated with COVID hit, companies, some of their competitors like Apple, were more impacted than Samsung because Samsung had diversified greatly. And you might think, well, okay, why was China a bigger problem? And the reason is because of their COVID restrictions. They took really strict measures that caused production and distribution to shut down in lots of China. And so consequently, having for firms, so if you have two firms and one firm is highly concentrated in China during that time and one's very diversified away from China, then the other firm has a competitive advantage in being able to meet demand. And that happened with Samsung and Apple. Since then, Apple has diversified quite a bit too. When the tariffs hit, when the United States levied heavy tariffs on China, again, having a diversified supply chain was really important. Samsung, I believe, is one of the largest, has the largest market share now in of any of the suppliers of smartphones in India, and Apple has made a commitment to grow it in India. But Apple's also moved, to having suppliers in the United States produce some of their components for some of their products, meaning reshoring. And, moving to India and Vietnam and Indonesia and Pakistan, et cetera, you can't call that nearshoring, but you can view it as a way of diversification. So as companies make these decisions, there's lots of things you've got to consider. For one, do these other countries that you're considering going to have the expertise to be able to make what you want to make? That's a big problem, and it's one of the reasons why there's still a lot of production that will always continue in China for a very long time, even if companies wanted to move away from it. They have become a manufacturing powerhouse. But you also have to look at, raw materials inventory, availability of materials, availability of production technology, and the cost of distribution. Some countries may have a lot of people, but they don't have efficient highways or rail infrastructures to get product, to get raw materials to where it needs to go to be produced and to get finished product out of the country. So there's a lot of legislation. Hundreds and hundreds of bills are being proposed to increase the amount of reshoring and to increase the amount of nearshoring, both. And a lot of the legislation that I've read, it's not clear to me how it's going to work. But I think as an individual firm, you have to always be looking at, if you were to reshore everything to the United States, well, then you've also exposed yourself to a new kind of risk. Everything is here. If it's spread out over lots of countries, your risk is diversified. So, but when you diversify your supply chain because of risk, it's possible and quite likely that production costs can increase, inventory holding costs, inbound and outbound transportation costs, but it can also guard against problems like natural disasters, an earthquake, or uh, you know, um, also against things like tariffs or regime changes, civil unrest, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at what happened during the pandemic, we saw at first there was a deep, what looked to be a slowdown in the economy because people weren't purchasing very much. But then the government stimulated the economy and people got checks in the mail from the government and they started spending again. How they spent the money changed. So instead of maybe going out to eat as much, they started buying things for home. Instead of doing recreation outside, they started renovating their homes, buying toys that could be used around their home, these kinds of things. So then there was a huge spike in demand, and people started buying cars. Some people that couldn't even afford cars necessarily would take their check and use it as a down payment so they could get a loan to buy a car. All of these caused problems because a lot of people said, well, the supply chain is broken. But actually, the supply chain really wasn't broken per se. It was just that demand spiked in ways that was completely unexpected. And this gets back to this idea of, you know, uh, making sure you manage risk appropriately in the supply chain, but that has to be balanced with the additional costs that are going to be incurred as a result. So, one of the challenges that the government has, again, if you look at a lot of the legislation that's coming out encouraging reshoring and nearshoring, it's not really looking at it from a risk perspective as much as it is from, in some cases, a security perspective, or in some cases for economic reasons to bring quote jobs back, that kind of a thing. Um, but firms still have to consider the costs and the risks, and it's very complicated. There's so much legislation, it's hard to keep up with it around this. There's also legislation saying that a new, I read one that was talking about a new agency, or maybe not agency, maybe bureau, needs to be created to analyze the supply chain and figure out which parts of the supply chain are most at risk, which kinds of products, should we be producing in the United States, this kind of thing. And the problem is that who would you hire to figure this out? That would be a big problem because I think bureaucrats aren't very good at knowing which products we should make and which ones we shouldn't. It's very hard for any human to figure that out, very complicated. As the supply chains are de risked, that is, you create more of a portfolio. Think of it like a portfolio. It's like, you don't want to invest in just one stock. You want a whole bunch of different stocks to reduce the exposure to volatility and risk. But as you do that, purchasing becomes more complicated because you have to have components and subassemblies and these kinds of things and raw materials delivered to different countries, not just the same country. You may be, your production planning gets more complicated because if you've got production facilities making the same thing in multiple countries, it has to be coordinated somehow. The more production you have and distribution in other locations, the more you have to proliferate cycle stock and safety stock throughout the supply chain. The more warehousing you have, the more variety of material handling you have, the different types of packaging you have access to, and even how you plan distribution can vary quite a bit from country to country. The type of transportation that you have available, all of these kinds of things vary when you go to new countries, and this increases complexity. Complexity leads to costs and errors. So this is why this decision is so complicated. You may have financial incentives to focus on one country for your production and or distribution, but but there's so many complexities that come about with producing and distributing in a variety of different countries. When you start de-risking the supply chain and moving countries uh, that house production and or distribution, then you have to think about the physical movement of the products and materials. How is that going to change? How are we going to enable this change? The information is going to flow differently. How is that going to be enabled? Who are the decision makers on the information flow? Who do we need to collaborate with? There's going to be different firms involved than there were before. How do we manage the flow of working capital, cash? How do we synchronize supply and demand? All of these processes start to change as you de-risk, or if you don't de-risk and you simply move to another country, all of those things have to change. It's not enough to just physically move the production facility or the distribution center. I think this is one of the reasons why nearshoring, reshoring, and de-risking fail many times or appear to fail many times. There's not enough focus on the broad set of supply chain flows, not just the physical flow. If you step back and think about it, the goal of supply chain management is to make the supply chain as efficient and effective as possible. Unfortunately, there's lots of trade-offs between efficiency and effectiveness. So, for example, if you de-risk the supply chain and you are located in lots of different countries for production and distribution, then the costs are probably going to go up in the short run. The risks might be reduced so that when problems happen, like a tariff that's really focused on one country, well, now the cost might be lower, at least for that time period, or a natural disaster. So there is an amount of de-risking that needs to occur, but it can't go too far. It's got to be managed properly, and this really is a key part of the challenge. By having production in the United States, so if you look at the idea of reshoring, if you have production in the United States, in many cases, this isn't true in every case, but in many cases, you're actually closer to the market. And if you're closer to the market, then you have fewer outbound transportation costs. Your outbound transportation costs are lower. If you also reshore your supplier base, then your inbound transportation costs are lower. But the problem is your production costs will most likely be higher. Your supply costs will most likely be higher. So you have to trade off, um, your, the transportation costs savings with the production cost and supply cost increase. But there's also other benefits to being close to the market. If your production is closer to the market, a lot of times you can respond more quickly to changes in the market. Let me give you just two examples of some of the legislation that's been introduced on these topics. The first one that I have here um, was introduced June 22nd of 2023 by Representative Brown, um, and it's been introduced, and it establishes a national commission on critical supply chains to identify and investigate the dependencies, limitations, and risks associated with critical supply chains. This is H.R. 4279. The Commission may hold hearings as appropriate to obtain relevant information directly from federal, state, and local government bodies as needed. The Commission must annually report its findings, conclusions, and recommendations for actions to mitigate the risks of future American supply chain disruptions. So that's an example of some legislation that's occurring that I had mentioned earlier. I'll give you another example. There's lots of them. This particular one was it is HR 7935, and it's been introduced. And it's the bill. This is the summary from the congressional website. You can go to, if you go congress.gov/bill, you can go to and find some of these. But this bill provides assistance to eligible companies relocating manufacturing from China to a qualifying Latin American or Caribbean country. So this is more nearshoring, generally a country in the region that has a free trade agreement with the United States and is not a foreign adversary. It says, for example, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation must use at least 10% of its funding for each fiscal year to provide assistance such as financing eligible costs for moving and workforce development to businesses relocating manufacturing from China to a qualifying Latin American or Caribbean country. Um, the bill also provides tax benefits. So the first example was just trying to identify where the issues are from a risk perspective, and there's questions as to whether or not that can even be figured out. But the other one actually is providing monetary incentives to get these companies to move to nearshore. So that's just an example of what's going on. But again, so you have legislation that's being passed that's encouraging nearshoring, reshoring, and diversification. And then you've got others that are being passed to look at where the critical components are in the supply chain. But then you've also got firms just trying to figure out what is the best way to manage risk. And I think that what we've seen is some firms have done a better job of using a portfolio kind of approach to production and supply than others. If you're interested in staying up to date on legislation around supply chain, reshoring, nearshoring, et cetera, or just what companies are doing, I find the Wall Street Journal does a really good job. I follow it. A lot of my information comes from articles I've read in the Wall Street Journal. So I think that's a good source for. And if you want to know more details, of course, if you read an article, you can always use a search engine and find other sources and pieces of information. If you think about some products that have simple supply chains, even if a supply chain is simple, doesn't mean it's easy to manage. For example, watermelons. You grow watermelons, you ship them to where they're going to be purchased by consumers, and they're purchased, et cetera, et cetera. You have complex supply chains like a car or a cell phone, a smartphone, where you have components that go into making components that go into making components that eventually make an iPhone or a car. And one of the big challenges from a risk perspective, if just one component is not available, it can mess up the entire supply chain. We also see in the United States that there are lots of new factories that are being built that are highly automated. And I think that'll probably continue. There's going to be more automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, computer vision, RFID. All of these kinds of technologies are going to proliferate in the production and distribution system in the United States. But I'm also curious about new technologies that are emerging that will help companies manage supply chain risk more effectively. If any of you know about these, let me know. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this. This was, again, a little unusual because I'm not interviewing. It's just an important topic that I felt would be important to cover. And in the future, I may cover the same topic, but by interviewing people that are involved in this. Thank you. If you're finding value in this podcast, we greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.